How sex drives evolution. There are a number of species that display some interesting features. For example, we have the peacock. In peacocks, males typically have these big, bright, bold feathers that go along with a long tail, an outrageously long tail, while females are often short-tailed and they're usually a more plain brown. The tails of the male are regrown each year, and because of these tails, males have trouble getting airborne. Darwin was actually supposedly not a fan of peacocks because they made no sense to him. We also have the Irish elk, which has now gone extinct. The Irish elk was actually not Irish and was not an elk. The males of Irish elks had giant antlers that sat on top of their head, and like the tails of peacocks, were regrown each year. And we are talking about 90 pounds worth of antlers, so it was no small feat, as you can see in this picture that compares the Irish elk to a human. These antlers were quite literally huge. We also have the Tungara frogs of Central America. The male frogs use their inflatable vocal sacs to sing these loud, long serenades night after night to the females. Then we also have Australian bowerbirds. The male bowerbirds build these large, complex, shady shelters known as bowers. They're built out of sticks. Depending on the species of bowerbird, the bower itself can be shaped like a tunnel, a mushroom, a tent, etc. The bowerbirds also cover these shelters with decorations. For example, the one here in this picture, it's shaped as a tunnel. It has a lot of blue, what looks like maybe plants, and then in this corner we see what are actually bottle caps. Most interesting about the bowerbirds is that they don't even use these as nests or true shelters. They're simply for show for the females. So at this point we may be wondering, does it make sense for an individual who is looking to survive to have these traits? Gaudy, flashy features might attract the attention of mates for sure, but they could also attract predators. For this reason, these features could be known as maladaptive traits, which are not so great for survival. Some of these traits might actually also take more work or metabolic energy to have or maintain. Irish elk antlers could not have been an easy feature to deal with. I mean, they were quite heavy, they were large, and they had to be regrown year after year. Similarly, peacock feathers had to be regrown, the tail part, and they actually make it a lot harder for males to get into the air, which could make them more susceptible to predators on the ground. So, why even have these traits? In many species, but not all species, males and females display different traits or sexual dimorphisms. Now these can take the form of color, songs, tales, size, behavior, etc. These features actually stump biologists because sexual dimorphisms have actually been found to be a waste of time and energy, and they also can reduce survival. This is also a problem with the theory of evolution. Why would natural selection select for traits that could decrease the survival of a species? Now, we're wondering, is selection responsible for the development of these traits? If so, how? So down here, we have a few examples of sexual dimorphism. So we have these birds, where one is the male, one is the female. Like the male is the bigger, more colorful one, while the female is the smaller, paler one. We also see the same here in these birds. We have one that is very bright and noticeable, while the other is kind of inconspicuous. And then we have some species where it's simply that the male is bigger than the female, and in this case the male has tusks while the female does not. And so these are just a few examples of what a sexual dimorphism can look like in different species. Sexual selection is a subset of natural selection that increases an individual's likelihood of mating and often results in seemingly non-adaptive traits. Darwin noticed that in species with sexual dimorphisms, the flashy attributes were almost always restricted to the males. Now, this does not mean that only males have the flashy traits. In some species, females also have these traits. Now, there are two theoretical types of sexual selection. There is direct competition between males, also known as the law of battle by Darwin. This is essentially physical battle between males. The males are going head to head, and the victor wins the female. Selection in this case favors traits that increase mating odds by a higher degree than they reduce survival odds. So with the Irish elks, the males would actually ram their antlers together, and the one with the stronger, bigger, more powerful antlers would probably be the winner. And thus that elk would reproduce, and its offspring would likely have similar antlers. The other theory of sexual selection is female choosiness, or mate choice, which is actually indirect competition. In this case, obviously, not all males are the same, and the winner is decided by the female. There is no physical competition. In this case, some traits, behaviors are more attractive, so genes producing these traits or behaviors would become more prevalent in populations as more females choose to mate with these males. An example of this type of competition would be the peacocks. Likely the peacock with the bigger, more elaborate feathers is the one who's going to get more mates, as opposed to another male peacock who doesn't have as many spots or doesn't have as long of a tail. Again, it is important that we keep in mind that not all sexually selective species follow that same common thread of males being competitive for female attention. In certain species, it is actually the females that do the competing for males. A great example of this are the seahorses. Female seahorses actually are the ones that compete for males, who are the ones that carry the fertilized eggs. Thus, the females are the more gaudy sex, and they display different behavior than the males would, and they compete with other females. Sexual selection can lead to a sexual arms race in which mutations in evolution continue to produce new and more complex weapons of sexual warfare. Males that are sexually reproductive will continue to fight for their mates, whether it is directly or indirectly, and females develop new and more complex ways to fight back against these new tactics of males. So there are a variety of tactics that are available to the males. There are both post and pre-mating competitions. So with post-mating competition, a male will mate with a female and then will employ some sort of tactic that will keep other males from mating with that female afterwards. So these can be things like literally physically guarding the female, holding on to the female for days after mating. They can also do things like employ an anti-aphrodisiac on the female, completely killing her sex drive essentially. And then there are also things like vaginal plugs. There are chemicals in the male sperm that would harden essentially and block the passage of any other sperm into the female. Some pre-mating tactics that are also used by males that have already mated with another male include sperm inactivation, which would be caused by by chemicals in a male's sperm, as well as something called a penis scoop, which essentially scoops out any sperm that was already in the female before the male inputs his own sperm. Indirect competition, or female choosiness, is actually not quite as understood as direct competition. So we have seen through studies that many times the females in sexually reproductive species actually do favor certain traits or behaviors over others. The question is why? One of the theories is that the more flashy traits tell females that the male is more healthy and likely to be a positive contribution to their offspring. So a male that is able to do a big dance for the female is likely healthier, stronger. A male that is larger than other males can likely collect more food, perhaps is a better hunter or gatherer, and these would be very beneficial traits for the female's offspring. A study showed that female African widowbirds actually preferred the extra long artificial tails added to the normally long male tails that were added and put together by the researchers. So the question became, why don't males just naturally grow super long tails? The likely answer is that the natural length of the males is actually near the point where decreased survival would outweigh the increased reproduction. So why are males and females going through all of this? Ultimately, the prize is reproduction. Survival is not the only aspect of evolution. Individuals really want to have the highest contributions in the next gene pool. Sexually selected traits will develop if they increase the rate of reproduction more than they decrease the rate of survival. So essentially, we're looking for a net gain. The individual may not last very long, they may not survive for very long, but if they get to reproduce multiple times, then they will definitely, or more likely, be represented in the next generation, which is really what they're looking for. So now we are left with two important questions. Why do females get to be selected with males fighting for them, and why are females selected at all? But before we can answer either of these questions, we must ask an even bigger question. Why even have sex?
One of the main mysteries of the evolutionary spectrum is clearly why sex. What is the evolutionary advantage of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction? Although there is no definitive answer for this, there are theories, as Jerry Coyne specifies. If a species reproduces asexually, say parthenogenetically, then it would be able to produce twice as many offspring, each a copy of that same species. Evidently, this seems like the most beneficiary method of reproducing. However, most of the species on Earth reproduce sexually. So why is that? What is the evolutionary advantage for reproducing sexually? One major theory involves the possibility of new gene combinations. When two species reproduce, they produce a different combination of genes within their offspring. Each parent provides 50% of their genetic contribution into their offspring. So this way, new genetic combinations are made. This is a vital method for evolution. These genes produced have the ability to combat environmental changes. Sexual reproduction also has the ability to possibly get rid of the bad genes. A topic that Jerry Coyne also addresses in this chapter is the unequal distribution and amount of gametes per sex. Male gametes are relatively smaller than female gametes, and they are also able to produce more at a given moment. The ways in which females and males mate centers around this distribution. Males are able to produce their gametes, sperm, in large amounts. This results in the male having the potential to produce a large amount of offspring. The only obstacle the male faces is the ability for the sperm to reproduce and attracting a female to mate with. Meanwhile, the female is burdened with many more concerns. Because the female produces less gametes and must carry the offspring to pregnancy, it is a lot more time-consuming and costly for the female to reproduce. Whereas the female has to produce the eggs and endure pregnancy, the male only has to produce the sperm. Because the female has a lot more to endure when it comes to reproducing, Jerry Coyne believes that this is the reason why females tend to be more picky when choosing a mate to reproduce with, whereas males don't have to be because they can quickly mate again. Males, however, must compete for their mate. When it comes to mating, males don't have as much to lose as females do.
What is the purpose for this choosiness? What is it that females are actually looking for in males? The idea of female selectiveness actually sparked debate between famous evolutionary biologist Alfred Russel Wallace as well as Charles Darwin. Wallace questioned whether or not females are even choosy. He hypothesized that females were less colorful because they needed to be more camouflaged, and believed that male ornaments were simply a byproduct of their physiology. However, he had no explanation as to why males did not need to be camouflaged. Darwin, on the other hand, believed females are in fact choosy, but he claimed that it was all about pure aesthetics and females wanting to be charmed or wooed. Ultimately, both theories are believed to be wrong, though Darwin was a little bit closer than Wallace. Female preferences have actually been found to be an adaptation. Choosiness cannot be simply based on aesthetics. This is because we would have to think about, is what one species considers beautiful different from what another species considers beautiful? This is called into question when you look at species that are very, very closely related in lineage. They can still display very different features and mating behavior from one another, even though they are very closely related. So preferring specific mate types actually helps females spread their own genes. By choosing specific mates, they are more likely to reproduce and have their genes put into the next generation. So what does the female have to gain by choosing one mate over another? There are two different types of benefits. We have indirect and direct. With direct benefit, a mate helps the female produce more or healthier offspring during the actual act of childcare. So the father will stick around after the kids are born and help take care of them. With indirect benefit, a mate actually physically has better genes that would be more beneficial to the offspring. So it's not so much about the father staying around afterwards, it's just about what genes the father has to contribute to the offspring. So female preferences will be favored by selection, and this is because as the female chooses the better father, they will have better offspring, and so both traits will continue to survive. There's the idea of the preference gene, which is a gene that tells females to choose one male over another based on a possible benefit to the offspring, and it will appear in the next gene pool and will increase in the population. Now, if a female chooses a male that can provide more food for their offspring, the offspring have better chances of survival and will pass on both the good hunter gene per se and the gene for preference of certain traits. This is in the case of a direct benefit. For an indirect benefit, if a female chooses a mate that happens to have a resistance to a certain disease, at least some of their offspring could also have this resistance and will have higher chances of passing on the resistance gene as well as the gene for preference in the next generation. And this is basically how the preference gene will continue to flourish in subsequent generations. The idea of the preference gene explains why females may prefer certain types of males, but not why they may prefer specific features that the males display. A question is whether or not these gaudy features signal to females that the male can offer direct or indirect benefits that the female may be looking for. As more and more females choose the males with the excess features that possibly signify benefit to the offspring, natural selection begins to favor these traits, and sexual selection exaggerates them until they become overtly gaudy and flashy, and they continue to catch the eye of more and more females, but don't exactly inhibit survival. So the theory continues to say that females prefer any trait that signals that the male will be a good contribution to the offspring. So in this case, there are two things that would be required. There must be genes in the females that increase the preference of these genes, but there also must be variation in the expression of these traits that can signal the condition in the male. With that being said, there are three types of genes that will increase in frequency together in this scenario. So there are genes for an indicator trait in males that would signify good genes, and then there are genes that make a female prefer this indicator, And then there are the actual good genes that are reflected by the indicator. So this is all part of the good genes model. So how would we test that? And how do we know if females are looking for indirect or direct benefits? The best study that was done with gray tree frogs, in which it was shown that the females are actually looking for the good genes more so than they are looking for the direct benefit of child care. So it is likely that the flashier traits also mean better genes, considering it could take better health to maintain these traits, such as in the case of peacock tails, which need to be regrown every year. You would need better genes, better health to reinforce the new tail. Currently, the good genes model is the favorite explanation for sexual selection. There is a third theory, known as the sensor bias model. Sexual dimorphisms could be driven by biases in the female's nervous system that had already existed before the current time. So these biases could actually be a byproduct of selection for functions other than finding mates, something such as finding food. The association with something beneficial, such as preferred foods, the success of finding these foods, could lead females to prefer mates that have a color that matches that same food, for instance. Males with this color would have an advantage, and thus dimorphisms evolve as selection favors the males that have this color and reproduce more often. Females derive neither indirect nor direct benefit from being choosy in this scenario. This is not the main theory that is supported for sexual dimorphisms. However, it is a very important theory, and it has the potential to be correct or partly correct, based on the idea that the sexual selection could have derived some of the traits from pre-existing traits. In conclusion, features that seem counterproductive can actually evolve because they relate to higher chances of successful reproduction, which ultimately is the goal of most individuals. Individuals are looking to have their genes in higher frequencies in the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that. Sexual reproduction offers a variety that can help species survive better, and that is ultimately likely the reason why many species are sexually reproductive and not asexual.